I think branding is usually one of the key things that we've potentially seen contention with in previous projects, especially when a brand is adopting a monolithic solution. In those cases, you often end up with a little bit more restriction on whether it's UI, look and feel, behavior, whatever. So brands that are looking to differentiate and provide a really engaging branded experience, composable might be the right way to go because you have far fewer constraints on what you build and how that experience works.
Welcome to the Ecommerce Toolbox Expert Perspectives, a podcast by Noibu, where we explore the elite strategies and cutting-edge insights with our expert guests. Get ready to propel your e-commerce business to the next level.
Welcome to another episode of the Ecommerce Toolbox Expert's Perspective. Joining us today, we have a real ecom vet in Steve Holsinger. Steve and I actually met at Shop Talk, which is obviously a great event. So welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So Steve, for those that don't know you, which I'm assuming a lot of people that are listening to will have heard of you at some point before, you're chief architect at an agency called DEPT. You come from the agency world, worked at Astound and a couple of other great SIs. Maybe talk to us a bit about your career journey. Yeah, I feel like that's something that's going to be really interesting to hear all about.
Sure. Yeah. Like you mentioned, I've had a lot of experience at agencies, but before all that, worked retail and kind of like, food service at McDonald's as like 14. I just wanted to work, and a lot of my career was uphill battle trying to get into places where I felt like I had the skills, but I maybe didn't have the experience or the resume to show for it. So straight out of college, I ended up going into small, mid-sized business e-commerce through the Yahoo store platform and a company called Solid Cactus, where I was able to kind of cut my teeth on retail e-commerce, but at a much smaller level of, transaction volume and things like that. And then from there, it just kind of kept going. I found myself working for manufacturers, building direct-to-consumer interfaces and the systems necessary to support those. And then camera company that has big competitors in the space and wasn't the main player, but, again, doing kind of retail direct-to-consumer type experiences. And then finally, a friend of mine who I actually ended up co-founding a company with later was reaching out to me. I actually met him at Solid Cactus when I was my first job out of college. And he said, I've got this demandware thing. I think you'd be great at it. You should come work with me. And I was like, I'm trying to make this current, company work out. And a couple months later, I realized I didn't feel like it was the right fit, but I jumped headfirst into demandware in 2011 and we co-founded a company a couple of years later. We sold that to DEG. I took a few months off, spend some time with my kids because a lot of my career was hustling and bustling, doing 60-hour weeks, trying to meet client expectations, but also I often had a side gig throughout the whole career doing web development on the side. But yeah, I'd say, the architect level experience really came in around 2014 or so, and I brought that to Astound, as you mentioned, after I took that time off. And then ultimately here to DEPT.
That's awesome. What a journey. Steve, we're hearing a lot about composable and headless commerce. For those that are wondering, and maybe they don't really know fully what that means, maybe you want to talk us through how you look at it from an architecture standpoint and what is composable or headless commerce relative to traditional commerce platforms.
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of people have their own definitions of it. And, you'll have the mock alliance version of it and maybe something a little bit more pragmatic from somebody who's done it a few times. I feel like I'm one of those people who's done it a few times. And ultimately, it's not that big of a change from what we find ourselves doing in a traditional monolith anyway. You find that, a monolith being the e-commerce platform that has it all, right? You've got promotion engine, you've got catalog management, you've got customer management, all that stuff built into the platform, as well as your experience layer, which might be, a template engine and things like that. The idea with composable is that rather than sticking to all of those things that are given to you by that one platform, you look to the ecosystem and find the right fit for you, maybe maybe the built-in promotion engine isn't quite cutting it for your business needs. So you look elsewhere, find an external promotion engine that can fulfill that need, and you integrate it into your ecosystem. That's a small example of it, but I think the composable idea is to start from that point where you, rather than like picking maybe this big foundation, you identify the key players that you want to have in your ecosystem, and then you build around that. Ultimately, with the expectation that as things grow and evolve, you'll be able to replace components with what's currently best in breed, whether it be a new search provider, reviews, what have you. For the most part, we're already integrating those sorts of solutions into a monolithic platform. So you may already consider yourself kind of in a hybrid composable state, depending on how many third parties you've chosen to include. But ultimately, it's that idea that choice is available to you and you're not locked into what comes in the box.
Makes a ton of sense. Maybe a brief explanation over headless as well and what the difference is between headless and composable.
So I think headless is one way of composing your experience, right? You separate the data systems and the systems that own product, catalog, whatever, from the actual experience layer that renders the website to your customers. So ultimately, maybe you have a monolith underneath and it exposes some of that data through APIs, and you choose to build and deploy a front-end web application that accesses that data and converts it to the web page experience that you want your customers to have. That is one form of headless. You might also have a monolithic application where you also have a native application, and that native application needs to be able to access product information, create orders, what have you. That's another form of headless, because the head is that experience layer, what the customer sees. And the way that headless is expected to be implemented is that there's a clear separation between that experience layer and the systems that drive it.
Yeah, no, that's clarifying. Where have you seen some of the benefits from a business standpoint with retailers that have chosen to go either the composable or the headless route? Like, why would someone do it in the first place, and what type of KPIs do they drive?
Yeah, I think it's important to have a real business reason for doing it. Otherwise, you'll probably end up in a place where it's not quite sustainable. The KPIs that I've seen drive that decision-making in my customers so far has typically been speed and performance. Ultimately, that drives better conversion. So the idea is through improved speed and performance, you can achieve a higher conversion rate for your customers. With some of my customers, that ended up being like a 1-second decrease in page load time, and that yielded approximately 25% increase in conversion, which is pretty great. I think that deciding what that factor is the most critical thing that you can do in your journey for composable, because without that guiding North Star, you're probably going to fumble around a little bit trying to figure out what the right direction is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it sounds like speed and performance. I'm assuming also some sort of like business logic that's not available through a monolith is important as well. Like if you have some sort of bespoke business, is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That could be a reasonable determining factor to go composable. You might find that the constraints of your existing platform are too great to achieve the experiences you want to give your customers. But most often what I've seen, it's purely performance based. One of the reasons that we can get better performance out of a headless or a composable solution is that the APIs of these older platforms tend to be a lot faster than the kind of all-inclusive monolithic rendering engines that are tied to them. So whether it be Shopify or Commerce Cloud or, Commerce Tools doesn't even have like a UI layer that is bundled with it. But, thinking of the Magentos, the Shopifys, and the Demandwares of the world, the goal of going composable with those as the back end is to just decouple yourself from whatever constraints you might have there. But ultimately, that constraint for Commerce Cloud often with the traditional like storefront model is a performance one. There's only so far you can get with that. And so in order to achieve greater gains, you ultimately have to build a new front end on some other solution.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have you ever seen someone go that route from like a cost standpoint, in the sense of hey, I want to have more flexibility in terms of the payment gateway. I know a lot of these large platforms will charge a percentage of GMV. And I don't know, like Stripe, for example, just announced that they look to be moving away from that model. Like, how do you think about it from like a cost standpoint, like a total cost of ownership? Is it something that's typically more expensive, the same, or like how are you seeing that play out in the market?
Yeah, I think cost is definitely a huge concern with any business, but from what I've seen, the cost tends to be a little bit higher with composable. You've got more moving parts, but ultimately, if you're driving more conversion, that's usually an acceptable trade-off. The reality is that you probably can do less maintenance as long as you're okay with what is on a monolith that you already have. So the decision to go composable is definitely going to incur an upfront implementation cost, but ultimately might yield lower maintenance costs because you have less technical debt to fight through to get things changed or to get the experience that you want. From a GMV and payment provider perspective, if depending on how you go composable or headless can allow you to alleviate yourself of some of those GMV constraints. With Salesforce, for example, you're probably not going to do that with their headless approach because it's essentially free hosting included in the GMV licensing that you're already paying. So most likely you're going to deploy onto the managed runtime that they offer. So from a cost perspective, there's no like increase in operational costs there, aside from the fact that you now have different developers that might actually be more commodity developers than what you would typically need for a Commerce Cloud storefront, because that's a very specialized set of APIs, rendering layer, template engine, that kind of stuff.
Makes sense. How do you see like companies that, so obviously if you're an omni-channel retailer, the way that you've built and curated your in-store experience is very intentional. Like there's hundreds of roles around that. How do you feel that translates to an online version of a template, right? I feel like, hey, like if you have, I don't know, two products that are very similar, like a Lush soap versus like another soap, those in-store experiences are very different and they appeal to the same clients in the same industry, but in different ways. Like, how does that translate to online? And is that more conducive with someone that wants to go headless or composable? Like, if brand's really important to you and like differentiation, like how does that play in to this whole composable headless stuff in your opinion?
Yeah, I think branding is usually one of the key things that we've potentially seen contention with in previous projects, especially when a brand is adopting a monolithic solution. In those cases, you often end up with a little bit more restriction on whether it's UI, look and feel, behavior, whatever. So brands that are looking to differentiate and provide a really engaging branded experience, composable might be the right way to go because you have far fewer constraints on what you build and how that experience works.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious, moving kind of the thread towards to build and maintain, whether you're monolith or you're composable or headless, at some point you need to make a decision. Are you going to try and build an internal center of excellence and compete with SIs and other retailers to hire, train, and basically build a center of excellence of engineering in a retail business? Or do you rely on systems integrators and specialists that do have more of an engineering and a building culture? Like, curious, like, how do you think retailers should be evaluating that? Is there ever a scenario where you should go internal or you should actually 100% go agency? Curious how you advise clients on that.
Right. Generally, the question is, do you have a strong software engineering business unit that has a lot of opinions and rigorous process? And if the answer is no, then you should absolutely engage with an SI because this is a very intensive process that involves a lot of moving parts. And if you don't have the right experience to build from, most likely it's not going to deliver the business results that you're looking for. Some customers may opt to do that up front and then pull in experienced resources that are affordable, but also maybe more generalized to support it after go live. And I support that for most businesses that are trying to, control their maintenance costs and things like that. You can always, if you have a larger project, you can always re-engage with an SI and have them, accompany your internal developers to deliver something that might be outside of their capacity. But in general, it's an important factor to consider because it's a totally different world than managing your product portfolio and the fulfillment process of delivering those orders to customers.
Do you have any examples off the top of your head? And you don't have to name, obviously, I wouldn't name any retailers, but could you maybe talk us through someone who's saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to do this composable build, then we didn't even build the website, but now we're going to actually maintain it in-house, and we're going to hire one or two developers. Maybe it's local, maybe it's overseas. Like, maybe talk to us a bit about that. We often see that creating some challenges from like a knowledge gap standpoint. So the people that built it aren't maintaining it.
Yeah.
You're obviously an engineer, you know that comes with challenges out of the gate.
For sure.
So maybe talk to us a bit about, if you have an example or two of when you've seen that and kind of some of the downstream impacts it could have.
Yeah, I think it always kind of comes back to the leadership within the company as well. If you have strong product owners that have been engaging with technical resources for a long time, then most likely that won't be as problematic for you. But if it's just, director of operations or something for ecom that's interfacing with these people, it certainly could be an issue. Communications is important, documentation is important. Obviously, if you have an SI working with you to build the experience, you should ensure that part of their scope is to produce documentation to enable other people to support it. I wouldn't engage with a company that wasn't going to provide you those things. Obviously, in the age of modern software development, and maybe it's not so obvious for some business users, but there's this tendency to try and embrace Scrum methodology so much that you don't end up with any documentation at the end of your project. And it can be very difficult to come in after the fact as either somebody who knows what they're doing or even somebody who doesn't, to get quickly up to speed and understand the inner workings of the solution without a kind of consolidated documentation of any kind. From the technical perspective, obviously, you're going to want somebody that's got experience with a similar architecture, but hiring that as a business user who doesn't do software development might be challenging. In such cases, you might want to engage with a staffing company that is more experienced with placing people with particular skill sets.
Yeah, and as you talk through this, I have some horror stories that I'm starting to remember where, I think it's a really easy out of the gate financial decision to say, hey, let's go to a template monolith. The cost to build is less. The cost of maintenance is going to be much less because we're not going to buy a retainer. It launches, it's okay.
Or so you think.
Exactly. And then you launch, and then all of a sudden you go, okay, well, we want to do this, or we have this collection, or we have this coming out. And then you're trying to change stuff and you're like stuck in like page editor and you're like, okay, like I actually can't do this, or it's not quick enough. And then it becomes, okay, well, let's try and hire, let's partner with an SI. You quickly realize that there's not enough flexibility to achieve your goals. And I think I could have seen this approach work more, call it pre-COVID 2016, 17, when you actually had within a retail, and you've been in e-commerce for a while. So the running joke was like, hey, e-com's 30% of the budget and 2% of the sales, right? Like it was kind of just, it was looked at not like the biggest store.
I think it changed.
Exactly.
Yeah, it changed in 2020, right?
And even now, it's now the largest store.
Right. It used to be
for basically every retailer.
Yeah, when I first started, and this goes back to that first question of like, what was your career like? Every project was like, we need a website because we need a website, not because that's going to drive the most sales, but because you need to have a branded experience out there for your customers to engage in, if that's how they prefer to engage with the brand. Nowadays, it's definitely the primary like sales engine for a lot of brands, and even more so post-COVID with stores closing and restrictions on businesses trying to pull back because just retail property is expensive, right? Business offices are expensive. And I think there's this post-pandemic world where we're reevaluating where people need to be in order to drive the value in business. And ultimately, it's funny because you're mentioning the store, but also mobile phones. There's so many brands that are still not thinking of mobile before they think of desktop. I'm seeing designs for desktop before I see mobile. I'm seeing people optimize for that experience or think of features that only work in that experience when 60, 70% of your customer base is actually on a phone.
Fully aligned. And like, let's call a spade, in-app shopping, like through Instagram or through TikTok or whatever. Maybe not TikTok anymore, but Instagram for sure.
Well, TikTok, it's a great example. I had a customer, one of the first to implement TikTok shopping on Salesforce last year. They actually sold more through TikTok Shop than they did on their own website.
Insane.
Yeah.
Insane. So no, it makes a ton of sense. So no, I think it's very attractive, but then I think you get stuck in limitations, right? It's a good example that I would give. It would be like, hey, if you're a luxury retailer and you're signing a lease in a mall in which you can't control the inside of your shop, maybe it's a bit cheaper to get, well, actually, it's probably not a bit cheaper to get in candidly, but like maybe it's like, oh, okay, it's not a big deal. But then like things progress a year down the line, 6 months down the line, and you may need to do something that you just don't have the flexibility to do. But no, it's great chat so far, Steve. So I'm curious on the future trend side, as we look to wrap this up, like what are you seeing in the market? Obviously, you've been in the industry for a while. Like, what do you see being something that's kind of current and of high value? And where do you think all of this is headed in the near future?
Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot about AI, which has the potential to change how we think about all of this. I think digital experience platforms were part of the headless composable ecosystem that people were suggesting we jump into in the past couple of years, but they weren't quite where they needed to be in order to create that environment for business users to make change on the site experience without involving developers, right? I think we're getting to that point where that's actually the tipping point. AI can help us get over it. And on top of that, I think the ecosystem of like what's an enterprise e-commerce platform versus what's for small business is shifting as well. Shopify, again, like making huge waves in the industry this year. So I think that going forward, that used to be not an option for enterprises, but with composable headless architectures and the investments that Shopify has been making towards the enterprise level customer, you might actually see that as an option, whereas previously it wasn't. And so that has the potential, I think, to shake up the entire industry in a massive way.
Cool. Love it. Well, I learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners learned a lot. Really appreciate your time, Steve. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
The Ecommerce Toolbox Expert Perspectives is brought to you by Noibu. To find out more about Noibu and how we can help you debug your e-commerce site and rocket your revenue, visit www.noibu.com. That's noibu.com. And then make sure to search for the Ecommerce Toolbox Expert Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found, and click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Noibu, thanks for listening.